History is more than just dates and names in dusty books. It's a shadow stretching across time, full of secrets, tragedies, and whispers that refuse to die. This is Morbid History with Thomas Gloom. Greetings, Thomas Gloom here. While this podcast always steers into the darkest corners of history, today's episode is exceptionally haunting. I won't go too deep into the gory details, and I sure as hell won't glamorize the abuse. But the show that you are about to hear will touch on stories of murder, rape, and incest. Listener discretion is advised. Austria, 1984. The leaves had long turned brittle, curling like parchment across the garden paths as Elizabeth stepped away from her home for what she believed would be the last time. Her suitcase was small, just a few changes of clothes, and a notebook where she'd scribbled dreams that now felt embarrassingly naive. She was leaving. She had to. Her father had become unbearable, suffocating, even in silence. There were no beatings, no shouts, but there was something else. Something darker. A presence in the house that made her skin crawl. Something she couldn't name, only feel. Joseph stood by the cellar door, smiling faintly. He said he needed help moving something before she went. One last thing. One final favor. Then she could go. So she followed him down the stairs. That was the last the sky ever saw of her. Above ground, life carried on. The town clock chimed each hour with mechanical cheer. Shoppers bustled through cobbled streets preparing for winter. Her mother wept, posted flyers, told the police Elizabeth had always been strong-willed, maybe too much so. Joseph nodded solemnly, said the cults were persuasive these days, said he'd prayed for her. Meanwhile, below the earth, a light flickered in a sealed, concrete room. It was a room with no windows, no phone, no escape. A room that would stretch minutes into decades. In time, Elizabeth would grow older, but never freer. She would give birth by herself, in silence, beneath flickering bulbs. Her children would take their first steps on linoleum floors that knew no sunlight. They would draw suns with crayons, having never seen the real thing. And upstairs, life would go on. Dinner would be served. The hedges would be trimmed. Joseph would smile politely to neighbors on his way to the hardware store. No one heard the screams, but they were there, buried beneath the garden. To the neighbors in Amstetten, Austria, Joseph Fritzl was just another retiree with a stiff walk and a tidy lawn. A quiet man, private, maybe a little gruff, but friendly enough. He'd nod while watering the hedges or checking the mail. Nothing that would hint at what was buried under his home. beneath the floorboards, beyond the bookshelf, past the key-padlocked steel door, down a narrow, suffocating hallway. A dungeon, a prison, a secret he kept for 24 years. In 1984, Joseph's 18-year-old daughter Elizabeth vanished. Her mother filed a missing persons report. Joseph shook his head and sighed. He told police she had run away to join a cult. It sounded wild, but the police had no leads, and Elizabeth had left behind a handwritten note saying she didn't want to be found. The case eventually went cold. But Elizabeth hadn't left. She was still in the house, just not in a place anyone would think to look. Joseph had spent years constructing a hidden basement, a chamber beneath the foundation. It wasn't a simple cellar. This was deliberate. Reinforced concrete, heavy doors, soundproof insulation, an air filtration system. You don't build something like that without a plan. Joseph's plan was this: trap his daughter, keep her hidden, and use her however he pleased. Allow me to read an actual court quote from Joseph Fritzl. Quote, "It was wrong. I was born to rape, and I held myself back for a long time. I could have behaved worse than I did." Unquote. At first, he kept her shackled. The room was small, damp, and pitch black when the lights were off. No windows, no way out. Over time, he unchained her, but only because she had nowhere to go, and her new reality had begun to settle in. She was violated repeatedly, alone, forgotten, until she wasn't alone anymore. Over the course of 24 years, Elizabeth gave birth to 7 children. One died shortly after birth. Fritzl disposed of the tiny corpse by tossing it into a furnace. 3 of the surviving children remained in the dungeon with her, knowing only fluorescent lights and concrete walls as their world. The other 3? Joseph raised them upstairs with his wife, telling neighbors the children were foundlings, left on their doorstep by Elizabeth. He even convinced his wife to adopt them, claiming Elizabeth had joined a religious sect that prevented her from keeping her kids. Let that sink in. This man fathered children with his daughter, then gaslit the world into believing she had become some kind of cult fugitive, all while he played doting grandfather to children he was biologically responsible for in more ways than one. The following is a paraphrased quote from Elizabeth Fritzl. Quote, "I begged him to stop. I cried every time. He would just stare. Then he'd turn off the lights and lock the door." Unquote. The basement dungeon became its own twisted ecosystem. There was a small bathroom, a cooking area, even a crude television. Joseph would bring them food, sometimes toys, sometimes books, other times nothing. He controlled their light, their oxygen, their water. He was their captor, their abuser, their god. And no one in the outside world suspected a thing. It wasn't until 2008, 2.5 decades later, that the nightmare began to crack open. One of Elizabeth's children, Kirsten, fell severely ill. After years in captivity, she was dying and needed urgent medical attention. Joseph panicked. He brought her to the hospital, leaving Elizabeth behind. But doctors were confused. The girl was pale, malnourished, and socially undeveloped. Her medical records? Non-existent. Her story? Even stranger. Authorities were alerted. Questions were asked. Joseph tried to stick to his story, that Kirsten was another abandoned cult child. But under pressure, and fearing that Kirsten might die, he finally allowed Elizabeth out of the cellar to visit the hospital. There, she whispered the truth to a nurse. Here's testimony from a hospital staffer. Quote, "She didn't look scared. She looked beyond that, hollow. And when she finally spoke, it was like someone unlocking a vault that had been sealed for years." Unquote. It didn't take long for the police to arrest Fritzl, and once they did, they discovered the hidden door, the hallway, the lights, the makeshift rooms, the decades of darkness. Elizabeth and her children were finally freed. Doctors said their physical recovery would be long, but their psychological recovery might never be complete. Imagine growing up without the sky, without windows, without strangers, without any concept of freedom. During the trial in 2009, Fritzl sat hunched in the courtroom, often covering his face with a binder to block photographers. He pleaded guilty to rape, incest, false imprisonment, coercion, and murder. This final one because of the infant who died shortly after birth. He was sentenced to life in a psychiatric facility. The Austrian judge, Andrea Humer, who convicted him, said this, quote, "He was not a monster. He was a human being who committed monstrous acts. And that, in some ways, makes it worse." Unquote. He showed no real remorse. As of this recording, Fritzl is in his 80s, reportedly suffering from dementia and severe health issues. Some say he's been beaten by other inmates. Others say he spends most of his time in solitary confinement. It's poetic, in a way, that a man who built a dungeon for his family now sits in one of his own. But the real horror isn't just the physical structure. It's the way Fritzl lived a double life for over 2 decades. The predator in the basement was also the man at the dinner table, the handyman on the roof, the grandfather at church. That's what, to me, makes it most chilling. Because Joseph Fritzl didn't look like a monster. Until you open the door to his basement. Joseph Fritzl's crimes shocked the world, not just because of their depravity, but because of their disguise. He was a father, a family man, a face of normalcy, masking a dungeon of cruelty. But he's far from the only example of fatherhood turned feral. Throughout history, other dads have crossed lines so horrific, they've become legends of the morbid. John List, 1971, New Jersey, USA. He killed his entire family, wife, mother, and 3 children, then disappeared for 18 years. He left behind a letter explaining he wanted to save their souls from the evils of the world. But he was so meticulous with the murder plans that almost a month passed before anyone found the bodies of the deceased. John lived under a new identity until he was captured, thanks to a tip that came through the America's Most Wanted TV show. As a side note, John Walsh is a saint. The Powell family case. 2012, West Valley City, Utah, USA. Josh Powell killed his 2 young sons with a hatchet, then set the house on fire, with himself inside. This occurred during a custody visit, while under investigation for his wife Susan's disappearance. There have been numerous attempts to have Susan legally declared dead, but at the time of this recording, no body has been found, and she's still listed as a missing person. Yasser Abdel Said, 2008, Irving, Texas, USA. He was an Egyptian-American father who killed his 2 teenage daughters in what was widely considered an honor killing. They refused to go through with arranged marriages and were dating outside of their father's religion. He went on the run and was able to evade arrest for over 12 years before finally being captured. The Hart family murder-suicide, 2018, Mendocino County, California, USA. 2 adoptive mothers, Jennifer and Sarah Hart, drove their 6 children off a cliff in California. Though not fathers, the case reveals the dark underbelly of seemingly loving parental figures. As an interesting footnote, a Season 3 episode of Atlanta was inspired by the Hart case. Anthony Todd, 2019, Osceola County, Florida, USA. Anthony Todd, a father and physical therapist from Connecticut, murdered his entire family in Florida, including the family dog, and then proceeded to live with their decomposing bodies for weeks. During police questioning, he claimed this was all part of a shared plan to enter the afterlife together, though all of this is still called into question, as his testimony changed numerous times throughout these interviews. As of 2025, he is serving a life sentence, without the possibility of parole, at the Santa Rosa Correctional Institution. Chris Watts, 2018, Frederick, Colorado, USA. Based on all outward appearances, Chris seemed to be nothing less than a devoted father and husband. Yet he went on to murder his pregnant wife and 2 daughters, disposing of their bodies at an oil site. Before eventually admitting to the murders, Chris was interviewed by multiple Denver TV stations outside his home, where he pleaded for the return of his wife and daughters. He is currently serving out 5 life sentences without the possibility of parole. Among these monsters, one father's spree stands out not only for its brutality, but for the sheer number of victims. The holidays are supposed to be a time of peace, of family, of warmth. But in December of 1987, deep in the woods of Dover, Arkansas, one man transformed Christmas into a massacre. His name was Ronald Gene Simmons, and over the course of 1 week, starting just before Christmas and ending just before New Year's, he carried out what would become the deadliest mass shooting committed by a single individual in Arkansas state history. And it started with his own family. Simmons was a former Air Force sergeant. He'd served for more than 2 decades before retiring and settling in rural Arkansas with his wife, children, and eventually grandchildren. On paper, it looked like a peaceful retirement. A self-built home on a secluded plot of land. A garden, chickens, a quiet life. But behind closed doors, it was anything but. Simmons was described as controlling, isolated, prone to rage. The house he built had no phone, no running water, no indoor plumbing. He kept his family cut off from the outside world. The following is a paraphrase quote from a neighbor. Quote, "We never really saw the family. Just him. Always him. The kids didn't play with others. They didn't come to town. It was like they were ghosts." Unquote. Then came the allegations. One of Simmons's daughters, Shayla, confided to school officials that her father had been abusing her. Not just physically, but sexually too. And not just recently, but for years. A child was born from that abuse. Simmons was investigated and indicted. But before the trial could begin, he vanished. This deranged man packed up his family and disappeared off the grid. He re-emerged in Dover, Arkansas. And for a few years, things were quiet. Until December 22, 1987. That morning, Ronald Gene Simmons walked into the home he'd built, retrieved a .22 caliber pistol, and began his spree. First, he killed his wife and his eldest son. Then, he turned to his 3-year-old granddaughter, the child born from his incestuous abuse. He strangled her. Over the next few hours, he waited for more of his children to come home. When they did, one by one, he greeted them, sometimes with a smile. Then, he murdered them. Some were shot, others strangled. Their bodies were stacked in neat rows and covered with coats and tarps. In the days that followed, his adult children came to visit for the holidays, bringing along their spouses and children. He killed them too, including a 20-month-old toddler and a 7-year-old grandson. He didn't rush. He waited, executed them one at a time, cleaned up, ate meals, watched TV, slept in the same house with the corpses. Here's an excerpt from a police report. Quote, "The bodies were placed with eerie precision, lined up like dolls, covered in their coats, as if they were just sleeping. There was no blood on the walls. It was clean, clinical, unquote. After killing 14 members of his own family, Simmons left the house on December 28, walked into Russellville, and began the second phase of his plan. He targeted 4 locations: a former employer, a law office, a convenience store, and an oil company office. At each stop, he calmly walked in, shot specific people, then moved on. 2 more were killed. Several others were injured. At one office, he entered holding a pistol and simply said, quote, "I have come to do what I have to do. You better leave." Unquote. He didn't run from the police. He sat in a chair, lit a cigarette, placed his weapon on the desk, and waited to be arrested. When asked why he did it, Simmons offered no apology, only justification. He claimed his family had betrayed him, that the world had turned on him, that he was cleansing the world of his bloodline. He was charged with 16 counts of murder, and unlike most capital offenders, Simmons refused to appeal his sentence. He demanded to be executed, even writing to the Arkansas Supreme Court, asking that no one intervene. In 1990, his wish was granted. He was executed by lethal injection. His final words were as cold as his crimes. Quote, "Justice delayed finally be done is justifiable homicide." Unquote. What makes Ronald Gene Simmons so terrifying isn't just the body count. It's the patience, the precision, the methodical unraveling of a man who decided that not a single member of his family deserved to live, and then calmly made it so. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a plan. He didn't snap. He decided. Fatherhood is meant to protect, to nurture, to sacrifice. But when that bond is broken, when power replaces love, something unspeakable takes root. From basements in Austria to living rooms at Christmas, these stories remind us that the greatest horrors don't always come from strangers. Sometimes they come from those who gave us life. This has been Morbid History. I'm your host, Thomas Gloom. If you appreciated this dark look into twisted fatherhood, leave a review and follow me on Instagram at Morbid History Pod for more unsettling stories from the shadowed corners of history. To all the fathers out there that show their families love, commitment, and protection while offering wisdom and laughs, thank you. As you've just heard in today's episode, faithful fathers aren't always a given. You are special. Keep it up. And so, for everyone else, be good to your dads this Father's Day. But if he offers to show you something in the basement, maybe bring a friend. Stay curious. Stay safe. And remember, history can be a lot of things, including morbid.